let's talk about a real paradox. Imagine a society that values honor more than life itself, but at the same time is described as being completely overcome by vice. That's the fascinating, complicated picture of 6th century Arabia that we're diving into today, based on our source material. This sentence right here is the key to the whole thing. Freedom and honor they valued before their lives. It sets up this incredibly powerful ideal, right? But it also begs a huge question. How does a society that believes this end up with everything we're about to see next? And yeah, this is where things get really complex. Our source describes a society that was basically at war with itself. You had these admirable virtues on one side, clashing with this really deep moral and spiritual decay on the other. So you've got these two sides of the same coin, right? The celebrated virtues versus this widespread moral decline. To really get a handle on this contrast, let's start with the good stuff, the traits that this society was genuinely proud of. Okay, so what were these big virtues? According to the source we're looking at, there were a few key things that really defined the culture and made it stand out. I mean, think about the kind of person this describes. They were masters of language, incredibly eloquent. They were fiercely, fiercely protective of their freedom. And they were exceptional horsemen. Our source really paints this picture of a proud, capable, almost poetic people. This was the ideal they aspired to. But, and this is a huge but, that ideal is only half the story. The source argues that for all those virtues, the society had just fallen into a deep, deep moral decline. In fact, some of their social habits are described as being, and I'm quoting here, quite outrageous. And this quote is just so vivid, isn't it? It says, drinking was so common that their literature stunk with it. Wow. That's not just saying it was a hobby. That's saying it had seeped into the very fabric of their culture. And it wasn't just drinking. Gambling, according to our source, was actually a matter of pride. Just think about that for a second. It wasn't some shameful, hidden vice. It was a public way to show off your honor, a way you could risk absolutely everything just to prove your social standing. The whole economic system is also described as being rotten from the inside. The source points a finger at usury, which is basically predatory lending, and says it was practiced callously, just shamelessly exploiting vulnerable people for profit. You know, when you put all this together, the picture you get from the source is of a society where the moral lines had just become completely blurred. Adultery wasn't seen as a huge deal, prostitution was apparently everywhere, and brothels were just a common feature. The basic social fabric was really starting to fray. But the problems described went even deeper than just people's personal habits. The source also highlights two huge systemic issues: the way women were treated and the intense corrosive divisions caused by tribalism. And this brings us to a really critical question, one that often tells you the true character of any society. What was life actually like for women? Well, the source's answer is direct, and it's absolutely damning. It describes their condition, their lot in life, as extremely lamentable. The specifics laid out are just stark. Women were denied the right to inherit property. If you were a widow or divorced, you weren't allowed to remarry. And then there's this, a practice that's hard to even wrap your head around. The source states that newborn daughters were sometimes buried alive. At the very same time, this society was completely fractured by this intense tribal prejudice. The source says that basically everyone believed that their family line was the noblest, the best. This wasn't just pride. It was a perfect recipe for constant division, rivalry, and conflict. So you have to ask, what caused all this? How does a society with such high ideals fall into such a state of decay? Well, our source points to a specific cause, and it's one that sets the stage for a massive change. The diagnosis it offers is really powerful. It says this wasn't one single event, but a slow decay. You had centuries of isolation, mixed with what the text calls a morbid insistence on blindly following ancestral traditions. It's like it just hollowed out the entire moral and spiritual core of the society. And the end result of that long decay? The source paints this final bleak picture: a society that was plunged into depravity, perversion, and dark idolatry. And it's right at this low point that our source introduces what it presents as the ultimate catalyst for change. The text argues that the arrival of Prophet Muhammad and the coming of Islam would fundamentally transform the Arab way of life and their entire way of thinking.
And so that leaves us with this really profound question. We've just seen a portrait of a society full of these deep contradictions. A society that, according to this source, was on the brink of a radical, total transformation. It makes you wonder, what does it really take to change a culture on such a fundamental level? What forces are powerful enough to completely reshape a people's deepest values?